Our panel is complete. You have all the names with you. Gentleman on my right is the Joint Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, responsible for many things in the Ministry of External Affairs. But today he's going to talk about India and Korea. Professor An is the co-chairman of the India-Korea Strategic Dialogue. We've just finished a 2-day meeting, which we will talk about. Naushad Forbes lost his way. He actually lives in Pune, and they've got rid of him to Delhi. He is an Indian co-chair of the India-Korea Strategic Dialogue. Dr. Jung, also from Korea, the chairman of the Seoul International Forum, senior participant of the Strategic Dialogue, and also a member of the Trilateral Commission. And he and I were together at the Asia-Pacific meeting last week in Tokyo. And someone who writes a lot in Times of India, someone who's very visible on TV, Mr. B.J. Panda, Member of Parliament, also a member of the India-Korea Strategic Dialogue. This dialogue was about the relationship between India and Korea. Where is it today? Where are we going? Is it in a good place? Is it in a bad place? Has it got potential? Has it plateaued? What are the challenges? What are the distances between us? So you've got a panel of 5 eminent members to share their thoughts with you. And I will ask each one to do that briefly in about 5-6 minutes. And then we will go to the floor, go to you and maybe have an interaction and a question and answer with you. I'm going to start with Mr. Dharmendra. As I said, he's from the Ministry of External Affairs. This is our external arm of the government, responsible for bilateral relations. So let's get his perspective on India and Korea.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that warm introduction. I do not deal with Korea, but I deal with planning and research. So I think I'll try to lay down a few ideas on how we are looking at our relationship with Korea in particular, and with as part of our Act East strategy in general. As you all know, one of the first visits the Prime Minister made soon after assuming government was to undertake a visit to Korea. That actually shows the kind of importance we attach to this relationship. It's been a very fair, even, low-key kind of relationship, driven primarily by our trade and economic engagement. But as events started unfolding in the area, there's been a pattern of economic growth sustained by commensurate strategic developments. During Prime Minister's visit, the relationship was taken up to a new level. It was made into a special strategic partnership. That gave us a more broader canvas on which to discuss and lay forward our views on the region. In general, we see Korea as our natural partner. The relationship has been free of any historical baggage. It's been driven by our economic ties. And, but as we move forward in terms of freedom of navigation, in terms of developments on the Korean Peninsula, the engagement did become a little qualitatively different in terms of exchanging ideas, in terms of exchanging views on how we perceive the overall architecture in the region. But by and large, I think India, our view that we have to be committed to a rules-based regional architecture that best addresses the interests of the countries in the region has been a fundamental principle for us. Along with that, our wide-ranging agenda of cooperation with the ASEAN underpins our general engagement in the region, not just with Korea, but also with China and with Japan. With Korea particularly, in terms of a qualitative rise, we have now moved from pure bilateral soft goods in terms of consumer goods into other areas, not just enhancing strategic perspectives, but also looking at defense cooperation, particularly in manufacturing. And there has been strong participation from Korean industry in defense expos in India. The other area we are looking at is shipbuilding. This is one area we're looking to partner with Korea, our partners in the Korean industry, and inviting them to help us upscale our industry. In terms of new areas, what we are also looking at is renewable energy, smart cities, modern infrastructure, and of course electronics. Electronics in terms of upcoming fourth generation and beyond technologies. From our perspective, what we are trying to do is roll some of our domestic issues, some of our domestic programs like Skill India, Smart Cities, by encouraging Korean industry to partner us in those sectors for mutually beneficial solutions. Obviously, we would be looking at technology, learning from the Korean industry, and also on small scale and small enterprises. The best sign that we find of this is that from fisheries to maritime to leisure and recreation, our partnership with Korea will only keep going up in terms of quality and in terms of range of issues we will be engaging each other on. On a broader scale, from the strategic perspective, developments on the Korean Peninsula are obviously of concern to us. We are watching that situation unfolding, including the upgradation of North Korea's missile capabilities and the reach and distance they are now attaining. That remains a cause of concern for us in this part of the world. But when we discussed that, in fact, yesterday and today, what we would like to also shine a light on is the abettors of that program, who all assisted in terms of proliferating these kind of technologies and enabling North Korea's attainment of these capabilities. I think that deterrent capacity and how they came about to attain that kind of capacity needs to be looked at more carefully. I'll stop there, sir, for now, and then we'll take it up as it comes in the Q&A session.
Dr. Han?
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by saying, what I'm doing in Korea as chairman of Korea Commission for Corporate Partnership. Actually, my commission's main objective is to nurture a synergistic collaboration between Korea's big business and the small and medium enterprises through a private, candid dialogue mechanism. This is sort of the social architecture to enhance Korea's inclusive growth and competitiveness. With that much, Korea's Moon Jae-in government has adopted a new southern policy to increase economic and diplomatic connectivity and linkages, especially with India and ASEAN. For Korea's business and cultural globalization, India is now potentially the most preferred destination of Korea's outbound foreign direct investment and market diversification of Korean export in the post-China era. Well, I believe the forthcoming Korea-India summit, maybe sometime first half next year, is likely to culminate in another big leap toward a special strategic economic partnership. India at the moment, what, sixth largest economy in the world, I believe. Korea being a near top 10 economy in the world, both with outward-looking orientation. And with this background, I think two countries can increase economic contact in a truly win-win framework. I know that both economies face serious challenges too in the area of the shared growth for small and medium enterprises, low-income bracket people, but two economies also working very hard to ensure that the systematic innovation across business sectors and SOCs to enhance and unfolding the fourth industrial revolution. Moon Jae-in government in Korea has set two directional guidelines for economic policy. One is an income-led growth model to expedite inclusive growth by adopting more or less a favorable policy for pro-workers and pro-low-income people to resolve a income polarization trend rapidly underway after the global economic crisis in 2008. The other one, this is I really would like to emphasize, is that innovative growth strategy to encourage all-out innovation across business firms, embracing the disruptive and unbounded ramification of the fourth industrial revolution. Korean economy this year is expected to grow above 3%, first time in 4 years. Korea's exports are likely to exceed a $5 billion total trade value. Exports, yeah, that's right. $500 billion, largely led by the semiconductors, automobiles, and electric appliances, iron and steel. Korea's total trade volume, including export-import together, is going to surpass a $1 trillion benchmark again this year. Korea would be, I think, this the fifth economy in the world, passing the $1 trillion trade volume with the 50 billion, the population size. Turning to economic ties between India and Korea, two countries have not deepened its potential economic contact as we wished to happen. Everybody here in this room is talking about this great potential of the economic partnership, but we have not lived up to realize its full potential. Well, despite the bilateral SFIA, trade growth between two countries is down from 30% to a mere 3%. The trade target, which was expected to cross $40 billion a year by 2015, is stuck at $18 billion. So, frankly speaking, SFIA proves to be a dysfunctional and needs an immediate updating. And Korea is now actively searching for robust economic partners other than China. We believe that Korea can no longer put almost all of our eggs into China market in terms of trade, foreign direct investment, and tourist flows. As you may be aware of that, the roughly 25% of our outbound export went to China market, and almost 50% of Korea's outbound foreign direct investment landed in China. Recently, however, most Koreans have been perplexed by the China's economic retaliation on Korean export and Korean investors' right after Korea's decision of deploying THAAD and anti-missile defense system. Well, while updating the SFIA quickly, Korea and India could be benefited from deeper collaborations of venture businesses to increase a still untapped potential. Samsung Creations Lab, located in Bengaluru and New Delhi, and Nodia is hiring 7,000 Indian high brains. This is a very concrete example, evidence of the great potential we can achieve between India and Korea. Well, Korea is a powerhouse of ICT hardware, and India is front runner in software development in ICT. So by working out active collaborations to combine these two mutual strengths of two countries, India and Korea can boost venture startups in a variety of areas such as healthcare, defense industry. At the moment, 97 companies in Korea engaged in producing about 1,300 defense-related part and component. I know that India is very much interested in Korea's defense industries. And renewable energies, as my colleague just mentioned, and the smart city development. More than that, Korea is now working on to set a global standard in 5G mobile communications as related to cyber connectivity security. This is a really new area. Both India and Korea can work together to gain a mutual benefit. And I would like to emphasize Korea's attempt to set a global standard in 5G mobile communication. We are going to apply in forthcoming Winter Olympics, and we'll go through a test bed period. So my Indian colleagues may pay attention on this, development. Well, Korean businessmen now doing business in Korea want to see improvement in the following areas. First, Korean businessmen really would like to see very speedy licensing and approval process for foreign investors, including Korean investors, especially in greenfield areas. And also, we would like to see more active intra-firm coordination and communication within a given industry or firms in which Korea invested by minimizing sort of the invisible social hierarchy in Indian society. And we also would like to see a streamline of diverse labor regulations, outdated, dating back 50 years or 40 years, and different from across the ministries and government agencies, and also shorten the administrative procedures. And also we would like to see more transparent in the gray area of custom regulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Han. Ladies and gentlemen, you've had one presentation from Mr. Dharmendra giving you a range of the potential and the opportunities, mainly economic, and one or two concerns. And from Dr. Han, you've had this image of Korea as an economic powerhouse, really strong on technology, going places as a country, made great progress, and talking about some of the challenges of doing business in India. Now let's hear from Naushad Forbes.
Thank you, Tarun. Professor Han has co-chaired this dialogue several times before. For me, it's my first time. So I'd like to start by saying, ladies and gentlemen, how much of a privilege it's been to co-chair this dialogue. And it's been a privilege because of the members from both the India and Korea sides. The high quality of members has reflected directly in the high quality of discussion. And it's been a particular pleasure to co-chair this with Professor Han. And
my
I
pleasure.
really look forward to taking this forward in future years as well. Let me start by the statement that we have this special strategic partnership. And I think I'm going to pick up on Professor Han's point about the economic sphere, where he said that this special strategic partnership provides for huge opportunity. There's this great warmth and regard for each other. We have not only very warm relations, but we have almost no issues of concern between each other. And then the question is, well, given that special strategic partnership, given this close relationship that we have at the strategic level, why aren't we achieving more on the ground? And in particular, when it comes to cultural exchange and in economic exchange. And I'm going to pick up particularly on Tarun's last comment where he talked about technology, because I think there's a particular opportunity within the economic sphere for much greater exchange when it comes to technology and much greater learning on our part in India from the Korean experience and the partnerships that are possible. So if we start with the cultural area first, something of much less familiarity to me, but our joint statement, as you'll see later on, has some specific areas where we wish to see much greater cultural exchange taking place. We think it should be a higher priority for us both, in both Korea and in India. And this should extend then across a variety of areas. It should extend to student exchanges, where we need to see much more of student exchange, many more Korean students studying in India and doing projects in India, many more Indian students studying in Korea and doing projects in Korea. And the opportunities exist for this to happen in a very tangible way, and we need to use our existing institutions like CI in India and the Korean Chamber of Commerce in Korea to make these exchanges happen. Second, in tourism, India is one of the big sources of tourism across Southeast Asia, but this doesn't extend to East Asia. And again, it's a great opportunity to see much more of tourism happening in both directions between Korea and India. I think there are huge numbers of Chinese tourists that come to Korea, and I think we can help Korea diversify its tourism industry away from China to the Indian market. And equally, I think we can get much more of tourism happening in the direction of Korea to India too. Again, it's an issue, I think, of setting the pace, setting those mechanisms, making it easy for tourists to actually visit each other's countries, where we need to then package probably and make available in a simple way tourism opportunities to enable millions of people to actually ultimately flow in both directions. And then we need to reduce the physical distance between us by increasing air connectivity. We have some limited air connectivity today, but there are many more opportunities to actually enable people to move from Korea to India in a more direct and easy way. Turning to the economic sphere, the opportunities are huge. I think I fully subscribe and fully agree that we should have seen much more in the way of results from SEPA, and we need to see how we can upgrade SEPA such that it starts to deliver on its intended potential, and it starts to deliver in growing not only trade between our two countries, but the number of companies on each side that are active in the other. Total Korean foreign investment in India is about $4 billion. Out of that, $2 billion comes from just one company, Hyundai Motors.
Yeah.
And we need to see how we can take the Hyundai Motors success story and make it an example to inspire 100 Korean companies to do the same, to establish leading positions in the Indian market and to use India as a base to export around the world. Because the potential is there, and it will directly address the trade issue, it will directly address the issue of building a joint and shared economic future together. I want to make one last comment about technology, which Tarun referred to just now. My academic field, when I used to occasionally teach, was technical capability in developing countries. And whenever I looked at technical capability, the poster boy for me was always South Korea and its example of building technical capability systematically and consciously from the 60s onwards. And the role that building technical capability played in the rise of manufacturing and industrial capability in South Korea, and with it, wealth in South Korea, is very direct and very tangible. And I think that example is something we can very valuably look at in India. Over the next 20 years, India needs to transform its innovation system. We need to raise our share of investment in industry and R&D from its current level of 0.3% to at least the world average of 1.5%. The Korean average is 3.3%. So Korea is actually twice the world average, 10 times India's actual level in terms of industrial investment in R&D. And there's so much that we can learn from that Korean example. As Korea transformed its own innovation system between around 1970 and 1990. The share of R&D in GDP grows. The share of industrial spending as a share of total R&D rose in that same 20-year period at a time that Korean GDP was growing very rapidly. And that double multiple effect is what we need to do in India in the next 20 years. And we can do it much more easily and much more powerfully if we do it together with South Korea. So if we do it together with Korean firms that come, invest in India, use India as a base for exports to third countries, use India as a base to develop products jointly, which we can then use to access markets both in India and in South Korea and around the world, I think we can build a shared future together that can be very powerful. The phrase that you'll see most often repeated in the joint statement is huge opportunity, and that's really what we have in taking our relationship forward over these next years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Jung?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk to you today about the potential of India-Korea economic relationship. Indian economy is one of the very few bright spots in the global economy. Indian economy's external balance is good. The current account deficit is less than 1%. India has low inflation. India's government debt is under control. And India's economic growth prospect is great, 7.5% projected next year by many international organizations. So, in my portfolio, personal portfolio, I should have at least 10% of my money should be invested in India. But what is the reality? If you look at India's share in Korea's external trade, around 2%. India's share in Korea's outward foreign direct investment, cumulative 1.2%. India's share of Korea's outbound tourists, 0.5%, less than 1%. India's share of Korean students studying overseas, I was really dismayed. I mean, disappointed. There are only 340 Korean students in India. That's 0.01%. So India, I think, has a potential of global economy 5 to 10%. It will be 10%, I guess, sometime from now. So why this dismal bilateral economic, cultural, financial relationship? And I'd like to propose a model called CAGE model, C-A-G-E. And this CAGE model talks about distance. What I'm saying is, even though there's a great potential between India and Korea, the distance separates India and Korea. And there are 4 kinds of distances. That's CAGE. C-A-G C is cultural. A is administrative. G is geographical. I said physical, but same, it's geographic. And E is economic. So cultural difference, of course, culturally, language, religion, lifestyles, values, very different. So we cannot change culture, but you can have 2 cultures closer by having more people flows and culture flows, cultural products flows. Administrative, Professor Ahn mentioned government regulation on both sides. Korea also has problems in labor and so forth. So both governments should work very hard to reduce this administrative distance. Geographical. I understand weekly there are only something like 30 flights between India and Korea. Between China and Korea, a week, there are 1,000 flights. So we should have more flights, direct flights between Korean cities and Indian cities. Last is economic. Economic means income gaps and economic institutions differences. So here we also have a lot of work to do. So I think we should set the goal, target, that we should set specific targets. For example, I like to propose, we try to increase direct flights between Indian cities and Korean cities from about 30 to 150. We should have, currently there are 300 students, Korean students here and 900 Indian students in Korea, so altogether 1,200, we should increase that to 5,000. Number of tourists, currently 2 ways, about 300,000. We should increase that to million. Portfolio investment, I said, India should take 10% of Korea's portfolio investments. And services and culture flows. So, if you look at Korean companies in India, the first wave of Korean companies came in the 90s. Hyundai Motors, Samsung Electronics, LG Electronics, POSCO. But 1990s was very special because Korean companies had 2 great opportunities. One was digital transformation. Another was Japanese companies were very defensive at the time because Japanese had a great economic slowdown in the 90s, so Japanese companies had to reduce their investment after the meltdown in 1991. So Korean companies had great opportunities in the 1990s, but after that, last 2 decades, almost 2 decades, we didn't have that much opportunities or activities. So next wave of Korean investment, second generation Korean MNCs should come in the next 10 years. We have a few candidates, like Amore Pacific, maybe CJ, and other Korean companies not known in India, but who have a potential to become great players, great suppliers of good products. So if we reduce 4 distances over the next few years, maybe 5 years, we'll see a second wave of Korean second generation global corporations coming in, and I will invest 10% of my money in India. Thank you.
Thank you.
That'll in itself clear up the trade balance.
You've heard 4 of the panelists, and I have to share something with you before I ask the final member of the panel to speak. So when I came into the room and I was looking at the seating, Mr. Panda and I were seated close together. So I took an arbitrary decision to move him far away from me, because I wanted him to speak last. He is one member of parliament who I respect enormously. He raises the level of the conversation. He does his homework. He's got excellent staff support, and it's always a pleasure to read what he writes and to listen to him. Mr. J. Panda.
Thank you, Tarun. You're not the only one who's been pushing me away lately. A lot of ground has been covered, and many things I had wanted to say have already been said. Let me try to add fresh perspective nevertheless. In the changing geopolitics of the 21st century, especially concerning Asia, the relationship between South Korea and India, I believe, is not just described by that nomenclature of special strategic relationship, but I would go further. I would call it unique. As India emerges, first as an economic power, and next beginning to play a role again in Asia and around the world, a role that it last played several centuries ago. It is being welcomed, in my experience, when I travel around the world, because of the rise of India being seen as benign as opposed to some other countries' rise. The reason I say our relationship, this bilateral relationship between South Korea and India, is unique, because we have certain situations which are not shared by any other country. For one, we both have neighbors that are aggressive, irresponsible, sponsors of state terrorism, who used to be part of our nations earlier. No other two countries have this kind of a situation. If you look at the greatest threats to the world's and particularly Asia's security, it emanates from these two hotspots, to our west and to your north. No other two countries, and especially certainly no other two democracies, have that kind of experience. And I think that creates an underlying fundamental shared appreciation of the world around us, which nobody else can truly appreciate. Our relationship also has other aspects that I think are relevant to mention. From the 1950s till now, in 7 decades, we started our journey in a similar fashion as two developing nations that were economically backward. And for several decades, South Korea has been held up as an ideal in India, as what India should have emulated, the higher trajectory that South Korea demonstrated in becoming a first world nation. We have not done too badly, particularly recently, and we are beginning to catch up and become an economic engine for the world. But the situation that we find ourselves in today means that rather than talk of emulating, because what is gone, we should look at complementarity. What South Korea has achieved in terms of manufacturing excellence and scale, the use of technology, and most importantly, the ability to go up the value chain and develop innovation. These have all been mentioned by some of my colleagues here. These are all not only worthy of emulation, but worthy because India's economy and South Korea's economy are so well matched, complementary to each other. So we have this geopolitical shared sense that is unique. We have this economic complementarity that may not be unique, but it is rare. I especially liked Mr. Jung's analysis of the cage model of distance. Now, the flights that you mentioned, I agree, are small, but the good news is that they have started changing. The flight arrangements, the bilateral aviation arrangements were revised only 2 years ago at the end of 2015, and previous to that had been only in 1994, after a gap of 21 years, and it saw quite a big jump in the flights increasing, and I completely endorse your idea, sir, that we should see a 5 times increase in the number of flights, dramatically more increase in the number of students to be exchanged. I have something else to say on this, but I would like to add that the cultural and the administrative differences are more stark than the physical ones. The physical ones can be, I think, overtaken fairly quickly. And that is because South Korea has become a first world nation. and we are yet to become a true middle income nation. Now, here I would like to make one important distinction. In some areas, it will not be possible to make bilateral improvements. They have to be general improvements in India. And in some areas, it will be possible to make bilateral improvements. So one example of general improvement is look at what has happened to our ease of doing business index. A dramatic 30-point increase. We have entered the top 100. But the reality is, when we are at 100, I don't know what the number for South Korea is, but I'm sure it is significantly higher than India. Until that gap changes, but it can't be bilateral. It has to be India improving as a whole, because the same red tape that Korean companies face, Indian companies face in India. So it has to be a fundamental raising of our platform. We have had two extremes of experience of Korean experience in India. At one end, you have mentioned, you've got the Samsungs, you've got the LGs, you've got the Hyundais. At the other end, you've had the POSCOs who have had, in my opinion, it was a very unfortunate situation that we could not take advantage of the proposal to build a mega steel plant, which would have been India's biggest FDI investment. But we have to recognize these are two very different sectors. When you talk of the commercial consumer sector, where technology and manufacturing capabilities are far more important, as opposed to a sector where environmental rules and regulations and the displacement of people, they're really two different Indias. And although it was terrible, I think it was understandable that it is not necessary that every Korean company would have had the same experience. The reality is, the same thing applies to Indian companies in both these sectors. Indian companies making cars and making air conditioners and making consumer goods don't face the same kind of difficulties as Indian companies who make steel and have mining and do work in natural resources. So this is an area that India has to raise its game for everybody, including Indians and Korean friends who are investing in India, as well as anybody else from the world. But I said earlier that there are certain things we can do bilaterally, which can, our relationship has already been jump-started, but it can speed it up to a much higher level. So 2 or 3 things I can think of. Certainly on the tourism front, a lot of bilateral effort can be made. Apart from flights, specialized campaigns, I believe, should be launched to make Korea more attractive for, India is sending out lots of tourists these days, all over the world. And India should be attracting huge numbers of Korean tourists. And the same thing can be done with students and with special educational programs. India is finally beginning to rationalize its higher educational sector. And I believe the scope may be there for Korean investment or partnership or collaboration in certain educational areas, especially technological educational areas. Certainly on the defense front, we have mentioned a few things. The two navies have started interacting a lot more. Ships from both our countries are making more ports of calls in recent times. This can be targeted to be increased quickly and rapidly, because this goes hand in hand with what I began my remarks with, which is that we truly have a shared interest in ensuring the free seaways, in ensuring the eradication of piracy in these areas without other kinds of vested interests, in ensuring safety and nuclear deterrence that some other countries do share and others don't necessarily share. I will conclude by saying that as two democracies, we have a much better chance of translating this fundamental shared interest and shared values and economic complementarity than other countries which are guided purely by strategic considerations. We are guided by strategic considerations, but we are also guided by inherent shared values and shared interests, and also the advantage of being two of Asia's most respected democracies. And we should use that to take this relationship forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now you know why I kept him for the last. I had a question to our Korean friends. Either of you could answer. And I think in a little bit it came up in the strategic dialogue. India continues to have diplomatic relations with North Korea. Mr. Panda rightly referred to both our neighbors. Is that a cause for concern for you all, or do you understand why we have diplomatic relations with North Korea? What is your feeling about this?
Well, I'm basically economist, and perhaps our former Foreign Minister Yong could be more eligible to answer this question. But from economist point of view, okay, well, as long as you maintain the relationship with North Korea, through which North Koreans can see, the rest of the world. Okay? In that sense, India can provide a good sort of the outlet for North Korea's outreach to the rest of the world, provided that this, North Korea they follow international rules and stopping nuclear provocations they have been doing. So, as long as within that framework, I welcome you maintain sort of diplomatic relationship with North Korea. My personal view.
Mr. Jung, anything to add?
Eventually, I think North Korea should have diplomatic relationship with U.S., Japan, right? That would be the normalization of our Korean Peninsula, right? So I don't think it's a very serious problem for India to have a diplomatic relationship with, personal opinion.
Great. From your side, from the Korean side, Dr. Ahn referred to 2 or 3 problems at the end. Approvals and licensing, etc. Is that the number one problem for you with India? What do you hear from Korean companies, Korean industries? What is the number one problem with India?
Well, I would say some, labor issues.
Labor issues?
Yes.
Okay.
And again, some, the India's social sort of the invisible hierarchy system hinders a free flow of the ideas across the various departments within the firm, or from bottom to top, or vice versa. That is one of the serious problem for Korean investors in high-tech areas. They would like to see more active, bottom-up sort of the approach from Indian the skilled workers as well as brain workers.
And Korean companies are interested in India, positive towards India, would like to do business here. Is that a...
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
At the outset, yes. Potentially, India is the most preferred destination for Korea's outbound foreign direct investors. Okay, I mean, Korea's development strategy has been the export-oriented, outward-looking. Yeah. That's the whole essence of the Korea. Why it's called a miracle East Asian, economic miracle.
It's an amazing story.
That's right, and therefore we would like to diversify, as wide as possible, as deep as possible. Given the Korea's limited natural resources and other factor endowment, for Korea to ensure a sustainable development, now we should move along that line. But here, I really would like to emphasize that Korean SME so far stuck to domestic market, but I really would like to see Korean SMEs also to get globalized and interlinked with the Indian SMEs in the venture business areas or some other high-tech areas. There are plenty of rooms, given the unfolding post-industrial, revolution.
Would any of the panelists like to add anything or comment anything? Jay, anything you want to?
2 things. On your first question about diplomatic relations, I think was well answered. But I think India is very sensitive to Korea's security situation. And starting from our Prime Minister's visit in 2015, and recently when US Secretary of State Tillerson was here, India has conveyed certain specific decisions, which I think are shared and mutual with South Korea as to trade relations with North Korea. Secondly, on the economic issue, I think we should not see this only as an opportunity in India for Korean companies to invest. The reverse should also be true. It has already happened that some Indian companies have actually invested in South Korea. And as India grows, the level of our economy as it reaches, I was at a different forum today where Mukesh Ambani was confident that we will be reaching 5 trillion economy before 2024. And the opportunity for Indian companies to invest in Korea should, I believe, also be facilitated and helped further.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Naushad, you want to add anything?
Just, I think we need to find ways of getting 1,000 Indian companies actively participating in the Indian market and manufacturing here. I think we really need to set that kind of an aspiration. And there are, I fully agree on the importance of SME relations and collaborations. But there are 1,000 Korean companies, medium and large, that could all participate effectively in India, either on their own or through joint ventures. And trade will then follow investment. And I think the same, I agree with Jay that it should happen in the reverse direction too. There are too few Indian companies. There are some nice examples of Indian companies that have acquired companies in Korea, but they're too few. There could be many more opportunities.
I would like Mr. Dharmendra to say a few words about our diplomatic relations with North Korea.
It's a tricky answer, tricky question, but look, I think in order to understand the situation on the Korean Peninsula, we have to go back to why it happened that way. We have to go back to the Korean War, the Cold War, and that dynamic which shaped that relationship between North and South Korea. There has been no armistice, there's no ceasefire. Technically, the two countries are still at war with each other. Meanwhile, we had the old Cold War configurations of the Seattle, CENTO, those kind of alignments. India judiciously and quite rightly so, we chose to stay away from that. So establishing relations, establishing diplomatic ties was the norm, and in that context, I think relations with North Korea have been established. But do also keep in mind that when we talk of North Korea, we don't just talk of the impact North Korea has had on South Korea's security. They've had an impact on our security. And this, by virtue of having diplomatic relations, by virtue of having that kind of a direct communication, has been made known to the Korean side, the North Korean side. So I think having relations keeps the channels of engagement open, enables communication both ways to take place. And in our context, I think we have been quite clear with the North Korean the DPRK, as we recognize them, that this kind of activity which has undermined our security is unacceptable. And we have at least been able to, tell them so.
Thank you. Okay, the floor is open for questions. I'm going to come back later to the former Foreign Minister of Korea, who's here, and to the former Prime Minister's Special Envoy and the Chairman of Ananta, Aspen, Ambassador Lamba later. But yes, sir. Very brief question. No speeches.
No, sir, I will ask two questions.
Two questions.
Two questions.
Start with one. We have 20 minutes.
No, I will ask very small question. First question, what is the income gap between the richest and poorest in South Korea? Income gap.
Okay.
Second question is, what is the progress of unification talk between North and South Korea? I understand that dialogue started, but what is the impediment if not, and what is the status of that dialogue of unification? These two questions.
Okay. Yes, sir. We'll take a few more questions and then I'll come back to the panel. Gentlemen here. Front table. Thank you. I'll come.
Thank you. I think this talk about the strategic architecture for Asia is quite important. And in one way, I think North Korea or the Korean Peninsula is where the most direct threat actually has arisen. So I'm just wondering if I can hear from the panel as to what India sees as the value that South Korea can bring in stabilizing the security architecture, and what South Korea feels India can do to stabilize that. Thank you.
General?
All right. Mine has been triggered by Mr. Panda's, and you're reinforcing it. One, with the diplomatic representation in North Korea, besides what the six-party talks are doing, or what Trump is going to knock the hell out of North Korea, what can India really do? You said we are there, we are outreach, etc., etc. Do we have some role to play? And the second thing is on the security architecture that is spoken about. In my view, without South Korea being part of, allied with the Quad or ASEAN, not inclusive but exclusive, you have to be part of any regional security architecture, whether it's East China Sea, South China Sea, or the Indian Ocean. Thank you, Chairman.
Last question, and then we'll come to the panel.
Yes, Manish Kumar from the Business World. Been to Korea recently, so this question is about bilateral trade. Of course, we have a bilateral trade deficit of
Just speak a little slowly so they can...
Okay. So we have a bilateral trade deficit about 8 billion, and I'm coming from the point, I'm talking about specific with the micro aspect of one of the industry, which is English teaching industry in South Korea. Now, that industry is about 50 billion industry, and there have been some changes recently where Indian teachers were allowed, they can go, but I see my question to Mr. Jung about this, is it a culture factor? They're not accepted at all in the system. They prefer the native teachers, the tag has to be there, those teachers who are from the developed nation, and their first language is native. Despite the, so is it a government role to facilitate, sort of, to bridge the gap in terms of the bilateral trade, which is very important, I think, because that's what we can import. The entry barrier to the Korean, Indian company to go in Korea would be very high, being a very mature market and capital you require. So this is my question to you, sir. Thank you very much. I hope you
Jay, can we start with you? Any question you want to respond to, and then we'll...
I'll respond to the general's question. I think he's raised a very valid point. What can India do about the situation on the Korean Peninsula? And what can Korea do about the situation in South Asia? Now, there's nothing that can be done immediately, but there are things that can be done that have a longer-term impact in correcting geopolitical imbalances. So one of the major problems we face is that we face state-sponsored terrorism from across the border, and these people are getting shelter in the United Nations from a couple of permanent members who have the veto. Now, this may not directly impact Korea, but Korea of all countries should be able to understand how unfair this is and should support our initiatives to bring about change in the UN and other similar multilateral organizations to reflect 21st century realities and not something that was structured 80 years ago. This applies to ASEAN as well. It applies to other regional groupings where I think we, South Korea and India, should be better able to understand each other's predicaments and work in cooperation to change the rules of some of these organizations so that they can be more effective. Because if we are to crack down on terrorism and state-sponsored threats, we have to do it uniformly wherever they occur. And we can't have different rules because a particular set of state-sponsored terrorists are getting cover at the UN or at other places.
Can I quickly come in and add to what Member of Parliament said? I think if you look at the context of the Korean Peninsula, the tensions and how those have come to where they are today, and what has been the response of the neighbors. So we'll have to, India will have to position itself such that we work together with our ASEAN partners in the framework of the ASEAN Regional Forum, where we have been supportive, we have been discussing with other member countries what needs to be done on the peninsula. But simultaneously, do keep in mind, you did mention the Quad, but there's also a trilateral between China, South Korea, and Japan. And there has been a commitment to revive that. And I think in the past, before the tensions between China and Japan came to a head 4 or 5 years ago, That mechanism of the trilateral did help address some of the peninsula, the Korean peninsula issues. Let us see if that architecture is revived and discussions take place in that framework, how these three important countries, immediate neighbors of North Korea, what kind of mechanism they would put in place.
I've deliberately focused a little bit on North Korea because we have our own regional issues on our western border. So we need to understand what South Korea also experiences day to day with their neighbor. So I think it's important for this predominantly Indian audience to understand and appreciate the challenges of South Korea over there. And you've got also perspectives from the Indian side. Mr. Jung, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I'd like to respond to two questions. First, there was a gentleman asking about income distribution in Korea. Generally, widely used indicators of income distribution, two of them are Gini coefficient and income multiples, which is comparing the top 20% income to the bottom 20% income, or 10%, 10%. And in both of these indicators, Korea is in the middle. In other words, among the OECD countries, 33 OECD countries, Korean income distribution is in the middle. So the income distribution problem in Korea is itself is okay, but key issue is youth unemployment. The unemployment among young people, college graduates. And this is due to the dual labor structure in Korea. Dual labor structure means there are about 30%, in Korea, 19.5 million people work for salaries and wages, and about 20% of them working conditions, job securities are pretty good. 70% of people much worse. So youngsters who graduate from college all want to go in. And that is the single, in my personal opinion, that is the single most important economic challenge for Korea, dual labor market issue. Question about trade imbalance. Economic textbook says bilateral trade imbalance does not matter very much, overall trade balance, because it's very difficult to have trade balance on a two-country bilateral basis. But I didn't.
Please tell President Trump.
Yeah, I should. I will, if I meet him.
You should, yeah.
But I didn't get your question about English teacher. I have two Indian students in my class. I have hard time understanding one of the students because he speaks so fast. So your question was about why Indian English teachers are not so popular in South Korea. Is that your? Maybe Koreans have prejudice. Koreans may have prejudice against people. Yeah, people, they may think, English should be spoken by white male or female. I don't know. But I think accent is one thing which maybe accent and prejudice, those two may hinder Indian English teachers from participating in the excellent job market, education job market in Korea.
Dr. An.
Yeah. Well, I would like to follow up the income distribution issue, and let me add on a couple more points. First, Korea has been regarded as a society in which equity and growth were simultaneously achieved. Our Gini coefficient used to be about 3.2 or 3.4 or something like that, and demonstrating both equity and growth together. But however, in the past 10 years, Korea's income polarization has going on very, very rapidly. For example, the top 10% of the Korea's population now shares about the 45% of the annual GDP. That's why the IMF and the OECD and the World Bank report that Korea should look for an inclusive growth and widely spreading the fruit of the economic growth with the premises that now distribution matters growth. In that sense, Korean Moon Jae-in government is now raised the flagship project, income-led growth model, as I said at the beginning. And that's what my commission is really working hard to how we can elevate the capacity of low-income bracket people through various measures, especially collaboration with the big business. Well, let me take this opportunity. Our Joint Secretary Gaddam, you indicated that India is very much interested in shipbuilding, right? That really struck me in the sense that Korea used to be a #1 shipbuilder in the world. Okay, we maintained that record, I think, in the past 3 decades or something like that, but recently taken over by China. Therefore, at the moment, given decline of the world shipbuilding industry, we have suffered from tremendous excess capacity. Ulsan, Geje, so on, so on. So, listening to your suggestion, okay, India is really looking for shipbuilding capacity. Maybe, I would like to suggest 2 countries study very hard how we can utilize Korea's, tremendous excess capacity of, shipbuilding industry, okay? So that you might bring in some mutual, win-win games on that context. That's what, I would like to suggest.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, I am Sagar. I've been in the manufacturing line from last 30 years. So my question is directed on the, side of technical side. Korean's government last 2 days have earmarked about $6 trillion for innovations up till 2026. My figures can be here and there because it's about dollars or about the currency. Now my next question is that we all know the South Korean education system is very hard as far as engineering is concerned or technology is concerned. So my question arises, what are the best features you are giving to the persons who are innovating either in the field or in the universities? What sort of incentivizing you are giving to the innovators on which innovations or the innovators you are giving on which the entire South Korean economy develops?
We got it. Thank you. Yeah. What are you doing for innovation? Why are you such a great success story?
Well, I think Korea really maintained this sort of the performance reward system,
right,
on a market basis. Those who perform well and through innovative ideas, they could be rewarded in the market. And the government also provided them lucrative incentive schemes. And one can climb up the social ladders. So one is good in the science and technology, and by creating like the KAIST, great institution, and our basic education system, started to emphasize importance of science and technology. And then I think during the learning process, Korean the technology development is very much based on sort of the reverse engineering technique. Okay? Yeah.
Can I, Tarun, can I add 2 sentences
on
the innovation question?
I think time is getting up. Yeah? Yes, please, Naushad.
So 2 sentences on the innovation question. One Korean company, Korea's highest investor in R&D is Samsung. Samsung invests $17 billion each year in R&D. and that's about as much as all of India. So every firm in India put together plus the government. So it's major commitments like that that actually makes the country at the end of the day so innovative.
Okay. The lady over there.
I'm very happy two members have brought about education of Korea here, because in 2001 I was extremely happy to have visited National University of Education in Choong. I spent 10 days there, and I talked to a lot of students. You know, they were very keen to come to India. They loved to come here, and the only problem was communication. And I think you should have an institute which teaches them either Hindi or English, because here you have a cultural center in Lajpat Nagar called the Korean Cultural Center. A lot of Indian students are learning Korean language, and they are also thinking of visiting Korea as tourists first, and then maybe join a university later. So I'm sorry I'm talking a bit fast. You said don't Indians talk too fast. But I feel you should really, language is the most important thing for people to communicate and come here. And I spent very good 10 days in Choong, National University of Education in 2001.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Lamba.
Tarun?
I'll come.
Well, we've got a very distinguished panel, and they've covered almost everything. I will just comment on two aspects which came up. One was my friend Ambassador Yogendra Kumar spoke of the security infrastructure. I just wanted to tell him that what we discussed was that the security infrastructure for Asia should include 5 or 6 items. One, maritime security, on which you have written a book. 2, energy security. 3, terrorism, particularly relevant to West Asia, but also to us in the South and also East Asia. 4, Indian Ocean, to make it, it's important for maritime security that it remains peaceful and everything passes through it. And the Pacific Ocean in such a way that even the small countries feel safe. Now, the second point I wanted to talk was that Professor Ahn mentioned, he referred during his intervention about concerns. I think we have agreed during the discussion that we should be sensitive to each other's concerns. And I will here refer to 2 aspects. First, I'll take their concern. It is the developments in North Korea. And Tarun Suomoto asked a question to Gaddam about North Korea. Now, diplomatic relations, a country like India needs to have diplomatic relations with all countries of the world. There is no country with whom we don't have relations. And in today's world, we need to get first-hand information. But see, the 2 missions were set up almost together. See what the mission in Seoul does and what the mission elsewhere does. Hardly, it's a very small mission, but it's very important for us to get, it's useful for you, for us, and for others to get first-hand account of what is happening. And it's useful to remain in contacts with all. Engagement is important. Similarly, we have some concerns which we discussed with them. Like, for instance, we talked of energy security, and there was a talk, the panelists did mention that in the 21st century, India should be a member of different organizations, which include the NSG, and we do expect our friends to support from all our friends, including Korea. And the other aspect was what is happening in POK, you know, so we would like an understanding there that much investment should not take place in an area which we feel is of concern to us. So these matters did come up. I'm sharing with you and we got a very positive response on all these matters, discussions. So we did agree to attend to each other's concerns. Thank you.
Sir, would you like to say anything, former Foreign Minister of Korea? Just briefly, sir.
I don't have much to add to what our distinguished panelists have discussed already in terms of security matters and in terms of economic issues. On North Korean issues, I just hope that Indian government and Indian people come together with international society, which has been applying maximum pressure against North Korea. If necessary, it would be very desirable for the Indian government to clearly express its will against North Korean effort to break status quo in the security sector on the Korean Peninsula. And the last comment is that yesterday and today I learned a lot. And I think our discussion identified all the important issues and topics which need our utmost attention. And in that way, I think we provided general direction in the ways of strengthening our bilateral relationship. And important thing is what kind of message we can deliver to each policymakers in the governments. For us Koreans, we need to deliver what we have discussed to our government policymakers, and Indian participants also probably have to do the same thing so that our discussion can be concretely reflected in policy making in both countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Quick comments, 10 seconds, as the television anchors say.
Several people have raised the language barrier issue. Although dedicated initiatives will help, I believe technology will solve the problem within the next 5 to 10 years. I fully expect a Samsung earpiece in the next few years, which will be doing simultaneous translation.
Dr. Jung.
I have a different opinion about education in Korea.
Very briefly.
Korea's success in education comes from overspending on education. And that comes from parents' willingness to spend 1/4 or sometimes 1/2 of their disposable income on education of their children. That's too much. But Korean parents are so eager to spend money on their children, and that's the reason why we have good human resources. But in terms of cost-benefit analysis, that's not good. We have to change the way we spend on education. We are spending too much money on extra education, the private teaching, tutoring, and also we have to change our teaching method. This is going to be the biggest hindrance as we enter the fourth industrial revolution.
Naushad?
Sounds like a good problem to have.
That's all. Dr. Han, anything?
Well, I think, every education system in any country has problem, but we continue to reform. The thing is that we should work very hard how we can cultivate the creativity from very young childhood education. That's a critical challenge we face.
Gaddam?
I think we should have more of these exchanges and more dialogues, get to know each other better, understand our viewpoints. So I look forward to the next 17th dialogue.
Okay, we are going to finish in a very different way today. We are over time, but a wonderful lady, I can't see her now, Dr. Son,
she's there, at the back, standing
made a presentation on culture today in our meeting. And you're going to hear some music now, okay? But we are going to get off the dais now, and I thank you very much to the panel. Thank you, all of you. Just watch the two screens on the two sides.
Nervous to announce this next performance. To call these guys international superstars honestly feels like an understatement. Making their US TV debut, make some noise for BTS!
완전 달라 baby 운명을 찾아내 둘이니까 우주가 생긴 그날부터 계속 무한의 세기를 넘어서 계속 어딘지 살려도 아마도 살려도 영원히 함께니까 DNA 이 모든 건 우연이 아니니까 운명을 찾아낸 둘이니까 DNA I want it this love I want to feel their love 이게 집중해 좀더 세게 날 이끄네 DNA 하는데 이건 I love us 우리만이 true lovers 그녀를 볼 때마다 소스라치게 놀래 이런 게 말로만 듣던 사랑이란 감정일까 처음부터 날 순간은 널 향해 때릴까 걱정하지 말라 이 모든 건 우연이 아니니까 우리 완전 달라 baby 운명을 찾아낸 둘이니까 우주가 생긴 그날부터 계속 무한의 세계를 넘어서 계속 우리 세상에도 아마도 세계도 영원히 함께니까 DNA 이 모든 건 우연이 아니니까 운명을 찾아낸 둘이니까 DNA 운명을 찾아낸 우리니까 후회하지 마라 baby 영원히 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 함께